The start of Olympic Games is because of the desire of peace. In the course of this event, countries are not allowed to fight against each other, and wars must stop. We say that countries who are guilty against humanity should not be allowed to play, as it spreads the wrong message to the entire international community. By not allowing them to play, we are setting pressure on them and forcing them to change. There are two arguments in my speech. Before I move on, I'll first introduce a counterfactual about how the world will look like on our side. I think that in our world, we are not putting a blanket ban on athlete participation. We acknowledge their hard work, and we also believe that they should have a stage to show off their dedication towards a particular sport. Athletes from these countries will still be allowed to join in the Olympic Games. On the other hand, their flags will not be shown, and we wouldn't be playing their national anthem. Therefore, we're trying to shift the emphasis on personal achievement rather than national pride. We think this would be an effective way to solve this issue for athlete participation, because once the athlete agree to individually compete, this shows their attitude towards their country's actions. They themselves does not agree with the action taken by their nations. Therefore, they will be representing themselves instead of the nation. Because we think that Olympic Games is a way for you to show their national pride. But like when you are choosing to compete individually, then you are saying that you are not affiliated with the nation that has done such atrocity towards the other country, towards the citizens of other nations. So we think that you are also showing your attitude toward peace. So we think that it is still we should still allow other people to play, but they shouldn't be representing the country that they belong to. So now move on to our first argument, which is about on the principle level, we are upholding the integrity of international sports. So from the origin, the Olympic Games is universally recognized as not just only a sporting event, but it is also a symbol of global unity, peace, as well as fair play. The values that the Olympic Games represent, such as mutual respect, fairness, and equality, greatly contrast with the action of the countries that commit these crimes regularly against humanity. These crimes are violations of the most basic principles of human rights and dignity. This is the exact reason why we shouldn't be allowing them to play, because it violates the basic principle of the Olympics, as well as violates the basic principle of human rights and humanity. Allowing these countries to play are allowing these countries who are guilty of atrocities to participate in the Olympic Games would send a conflicting and damaging message to the entire international community. It suggested that the international community is willing to let go of these severe human rights violations for the sake of maintaining the appearance of inclusivity in sports. We see that they spread the wrong message. This will erode the credibility of Olympics as a moral and ethical standard guideline in the global area. And banning these countries from participating in these sporting events will reinforce the value of dignity, and will uphold the value of dignity. It will demonstrate that the Olympic Games is not just about artists athletes competing in the event, but it is also a way that we're showing the attitude to the globe that we are promoting peace and human dignity instead of letting go of countries who committed atrocities. Such a stance will signal the world that countries engaging in severe human rights abuses cannot be exempt from participating in international sporting events and celebrate themselves for their achievements. So we're showing the message to the world that we are not allowing these things to happen. So now moving on to our second argument, which is about leveraging international pressure for change. The Olympic Games is the most prestigious and widely watched event in the world. So unlike any other sporting event, the Olympics emphasizes participate from like all around the world. There's a lot of media exposure on this event, and this attracts a lot of powerful platform for a lot of powerful platform for live streaming and is and it and the game is watched from all around the world, and it can influence international and it greatly influences the international audiences. By excluding the countries who are guilty of the crimes against humanity can successfully raise awareness. The international community can also use the Olympic as a form of nonviolent sanction, applying pressure on these countries to change their policies and to change their behaviors. Participation in the Olympic is a matter of national pride and international recognition. because when you score gold on that game, then it is also a representation of your country's power. Being banned from such a significant event will be a source of embarrassment and a loss of face for any other country, especially those countries who see themselves as global superpowers and have a large influence internationally. The exclusion from the Olympic Games could means that you are also the international community is also sanctioning that country. It is a silent and non-violent sanction, which is better because it doesn't really affect the citizens. We see that once we have this sort of non-violent sanction, it is actually likely going to be effective. It pressures the country to change, and we see that is on our side, the practical impact given on our side is that wars will be able to stop, and we believe that there will also be a lot of protests inside the country to try to pressure the country to change and to change their behaviors. So we think that upholding the value of integrity is incredibly important, and through banning these country from participating in sports will mean that the country will not only face internal pressure from its citizens, but they will also face external pressure from the international community. So on our side, both of these pressure, they can pressure the country to change, and we think that because Olympics is not only a stage for people to share their talents, it is also a stage for us to try to spread the important message of global peace. So we see that using this platform is a way to sanction the countries and try to sanction them and pressure them into making tangible changes towards their actions. So based on all of these reasons above, we have successfully tell you that why allowing these countries to so participate will harm will, will like harm the values that the Olympic is trying to spread, and also we tell you that these countries were likely going to change. So for all of these reasons above, we also protest down on the opening government. Thank you.
Opposition stance is that all countries should have the right to compete in the Olympics, since we are better able to uphold the principle of the Olympics and to also protect the athletes involved. We have two things in our setup. First of all, framing and characterization, and two, our metrics. First, going on to our framing and characterization. First of all, under our world, regardless of whether the country committed the humanitarian act or not, we will also allow the players from these countries to play and join in the Olympics. But then we don't think that these Olympians will radically portray their political ideologies or country ideologies in these Olympic platforms, because first, they know that these ideologies or just the mentioning of the situation itself is very, very controversial. So they know that if they do anything explicit, like it's not only going to put them into controversy, but two, it's likely that they're going to focus on their sport more, because that's literally what they're here for. But then secondly, we think that there are so many other ways that we can do to punish countries that are found guilty of crimes against humanity. And we think that that's where we also co-opt opening government's second argument about how we pressure these countries. And it's because there are things like sanctions, international criminal court, and etc. We think that directly punishing those who are responsible for the actions, usually the government or the countries, like politicians or whatever, we think that policy or that metric is so much more effective in actually pressuring these countries to conform to better policies and better metrics. But then what are the two metrics in today's debate? First of all, which side is better able to uphold the principle of the Olympics? But two, which side is better able to protect the athletes involved in the games? Now, before we move on to our two arguments, quick rebuttals. First of all, opening government gives you a very confusing framing on how they will still allow the athlete to compete, but just like without their national flag. But then three responses to this. First of all, we think that is like not the motion at all. It literally says in the motion that that country is outright banned from joining these Olympics. But two, they provide you no mechanism on how the Olympian is actually going to go through all of those like complicated steps to actually achieve that, especially given that like in Olympics, like the first thing that players do is that they represent their nation, they represent their flag, and etc. But then thirdly, even if we accept like everything that they said, we think that this entire process that the athlete has to go through in the end of the day is just too complicated for the athlete. And even under this circumstance, it's just unjustified for the athlete to go go through all of the complexities and go through all of that steps. And we think that these players should be able to get fair treatment as the other athletes. But then they say in their first argument that they should uphold the integrity of international sports. But then, first of all, we have two responses to this. First of all, we outright reject this, because if Olympics is more about peace and cooperation, it's better done through inclusivity and recognition, which I'll later expand in my first argument. But even if we exclude these countries because of all these political reasons, you're outright politicizing these Olympics, that, oh, because you're politically immoral, you should not be included. We think that that measure inevitably makes the Olympics be more involved in the political controversy, which in turn leads to that exacerbation in that global like non-cooperation and etc. But then going on to our first argument about how it is an unfair punishment for these athletes, and how we opening opposition are better able to uphold the principle of the Olympics. This is based on the premise that the purpose of Olympics Games is to celebrate human achievements and promote international cooperation that transcends political conflicts. But why is this premise true? Because Olympics has been always been there in order to make nations come together and compete in different sports, right? It is for the greater people in the public to cheer for their nation and to come together as one for their nation. It is also a platform to celebrate the individual efforts of the athletes and the way they have tried and dedicated so much time in their life to actually come up to that platform. But then secondly, the International Olympic Committee, or the IOC, has long emphasized the principles of being apolitical. Examples include inclusiveness in participation during the Cold War era and North and South Korea marching together in the 2018 Winter Olympics. But B, why does this principle outweigh the other goals of the IOC? First of all, they cannot fulfill their goals of using sports as a unifying platform if they have prejudice against athletes and countries wronged by birth lottery. But then two, they cannot ensure long-term sustainability if they discriminate against athletes for political problems that have alternative solutions. But three, they cannot promote peace and cultural exchange when the process of government benches policy is inherently controversial and alienating. But then C, on the implication, we think that the prerequisite to the goals identified by the government bench is universal participation that can only happen within a political stance. But then the second layer about why it's an unfair punishment for these athletes. First of all, we think that the athletes should not be punished by this blanket policy in any way, because the hard work that they put in practicing their own sport is in not any way related to this political conflict, but they have no connection to these bad deeds of the country, depending of this country or whatsoever. So we think that this is unjustified, because this not only goes against the general principle, we think that there are so many other alternatives that are available to punish these countries and punish the actual perpetrators involved, rather than punishing these athletes who have spent so much of their time actually making their skills so much better and actually allowing them to emerge in that Olympic platform. But then why is this argument so important? We think that this is important because, first of all, global cooperation and peace is only able to actually happen under our side, where we actually include these countries, not because of their political conflict, but for their athletes and for their nation coming together, of cheering for that athlete. But then secondly, we are the one who is better able to protect these athletes who have spent literally their entire lives actually trying to come up that social ladder to perform in the Olympics. But then onto our second argument about the likelihood for abuse. This is based on the premise that Western states have long used supposedly neutral international organizations to forward their causes unjustly. For example, using the IMF and World Bank to impose democratic reforms and austerity measures on developing and undemocratic countries to spread their ideology, using trade agreements and aid donations to prop up favorable regimes in developing countries at the expense of people on the ground. But what is the mechanism to this? First of all, veil of legitimacy. Government bench cannot assume that the arbitration of policy will be done well. The West itself has been implicated with HR abuses from colonialism, military interventions, and economic sanctions. However, because they have the capacity to selectively apply this policy, they hide under a veil of legitimacy to solely focus on the HR violations of the countries they are politically against. But two, selective application. This policy will be used unfairly by targeting countries that are not aligned with Western interests, but will ignore those allies even with violations, such as boycotting Moscow Olympics. Therefore, opening opposition is the one who is able to, first of all, uphold the principle of the justice of the Olympics, and also protect the Olympians who are involved in the Olympics. For all these reasons, we are very proud to oppose.
Allowing countries guilty of their crimes against humanitarian to compete in the Olympics would not only betray the spirit of the games, but also undermine our global commitment to justice and humanitarian rights. So overall, very proud to stand on side proposition. I think before I give some rebuttals and also some rebuilds and also explain why we win against OO, we wanted to do some recharacterizations. We believe that we are on our side, we are able to let athletes that on their social media, they have not spread any scrutiny or other things that are very insulting to other nations that maybe their current nation is opposing from, they're still able to join. Why? Because we believe that as in the status quo, they are actually banning Russia to join the Paris 2024, right? However, some athletes from Russia are still able to complete as a neutral individual athletes themselves, and also there will be people actually watching them, and also they're still able to go to the Olympics and actually demonstrate at what they have learned within their past lives. So yeah, so before I give some rebuildings, I just wanted to give some rebuttals to my opponents. Okay, the first one is that on their side, they are able to make the nations to come together because of the aim of Olympics. However, we believe that the Olympics, like the principle of Olympic, is set up firstly, definitely unity, but unity with peace, right? We believe that in terms of like letting nations to come together in order to celebrate their achievements, their own athletes' achievement. We believe that this is based on a premise that every nation are actually very respectful to other nations so that they are able to come together. I think allowing them to join will basically create chaos in this situation. So basically, we believe that in order, for example, to allow other people to join, allow the people with humanitarian crimes to join, a lot of athletes are just opposing to that kind of country, the behavior of that country joining the Olympics, so that basically it's not just solely just competing on their personal skills, but they will oftentimes just they just say war and peace and also some very offensive remarks made to those countries who have committed to those crimes. We believe that this makes the place Olympics not a place where just purely need to compete with each other and demonstrate their skills, but also make this completely chaotic and also increase the hatred between certain nations and also hatred between the audiences. Maybe some audiences from Russia is cheering for them for their own athletes. However, the other people who hate Russia may comment to them or do any offensive reactions, right? So basically, we believe that the overall, in order for those countries, those nations that have peace and also not violated against any humanitarian rights to join, we're able to promote peace among. So basically, on side opposition, this argument does not stand at all because there are some very impulsive people that feel bad for those people who are in the humanitarian crisis and therefore stand up. However, we believe that this action will increase the sense of chaotic of the entire Olympic Games. And then I will set a PLI.
So, but won't that won't that offensive remarks also happen under your side if the athletes from these nations also join?
Okay, so basically people understood that those athletes are actually representing themselves as individuals, right? Because overall, we believe that we are actually not selecting athletes who have actually sent those very controversial remarks on their social media. They themselves are not joining. And secondly, we believe that the athletes are joining, they're representing their own nations. So people will know that they're actually representing themselves. No, they're representing themselves, right? People will know that they will be representing themselves. So they will demonstrate their own strength and also the hard work that they have paid and then to bring to the Olympics performance. And then secondly, in terms of like this unfair punishment, right? However, we believe that on our side, the Olympics is not just only about individual athletes. It is also about upholding a universal values such as human rights and dignity. So we're banning those countries with severe human rights violations to enter this Olympics. However, for those individuals who are actually working hard and never have those offensive remarks and also very rational, they're still allowed to join and to compete for themselves. So I don't think this unfair punishment would exist on our side. So then finally, they have addressed a point of those Westerns behavior. For example, in the IMF and also and those kind of things. We believe that in terms of this, it will not only just create or like put the underprivileged or developing countries in the opposite world. However, for those countries who are actually have severe humanitarian crisis, maybe it's a proxy war. They themselves are not directly in this sense of a crisis. However, they have also are against this humanitarian rights, they're also still not allowed to compete. We believe that Olympics is purely a place which align with the goal of peace, but instead of there's wars or all kinds of proxy wars or IMF to like have those post those on very not to yeah. So overall, we believe that on our side, for those countries, it will not be, for example, people not letting those other countries, the Western countries, not letting other small countries to join or something. However, we believe that it will be a fair solution. And it is a solution that encourages the huge Western countries, those global superpowers, to stop their behavior, or else their own athletes are not able to represent their own home country. So basically, we believe that on our side, we have maybe two main arguments. The first one is on the principally incorrect, and the second one is put things into spotlight. So in terms of like the first argument, we have continuously emphasizes about the essentiality of promoting quality and peace and unity. And secondly, in terms of like entering them to spotlight, I think that the concern of those Western countries having those also violating some humanitarian crisis, it will be put into spotlight, right? And that actually pressures them to change because they themselves are very proud. They want to compete about everything, their economical status, their GDP, and also their behavior of athletes. However, if their athletes are not going to represent their nation, it's definitely not beneficial for them, right? So basically, they will incentivize them to change their behavior under this international pressure. So overall, we believe that by putting things into spotlight, and because millions and thousands of people are watching this stream, right? So basically, we're able to put things into spotlight and better solve this whole situation. So overall, very proud to stand on OG.
Many nations have a tainted past, be it from previous civil wars and conflicts to abuses from dictatorial governments. On both sides, there are international organizations that correct these wrongs. Therefore, the direct harm and backlash from the government's policy is simply unnecessary in this debate. What is the win condition of this debate? This debate isn't a comparative of countries who committed crime competing in Olympics versus these countries going unpunished. That's just not the case. The real comparative of this debate is their world, where you're spending a lot of media attention, where you're spending a lot of social capital and attention trying to punish these countries just like by preventing like their athletes from competing in the Olympics, and that's not even the case, versus our world where we actually have attention of these countries by punishing them based on actual proper ways, not just whatever Olympics alternative that they have. Before anything, a few responses. First of all, there's a clear problem solution mismatch on government side. While we agree that these countries are guilty of human rights abuses, boycotting and preventing them from hosting will not solve this problem because that's an indirect solution. In opposition, we still have UN Human Rights Council, International Criminal Court, and economic sanctions by states and regional organizations to push guilty nations. In fact, the policy of the government bench decreases the legitimacy and resources for these proper punishments because it focuses on short-term condonement and limited resources. And note that there are limited resources, media attention, and political power that are used to instead persuade or boycott these countries, or like prevent these athletes from competing under their world instead of supporting like these international bodies. That is to say that under their world, the kind of media attention surrounding the crimes of these countries are likely to be based off the Olympics because people care about the Olympics instead of actually getting productive, tangible change and actual punishments. Note here that they cannot have both on the government bench. Gov's policy is not only just a mismatch, but it's actively harming the pursuit of justice because you're just deflecting the kind of media attention that they have. But secondly, it's just not going to be effective. We do not think it's an effective form of punishment in the first place. That is to say that this argument that they say is only as strong as the government's capability to prove that the policy will actually lead to a change in the situation and the government's policy stances. We tell you that the policy will not improve the situation because these states are unlikely to adjust and change their behaviors just because of an inability to host sports sporting events. Like if I'm China, I'm not going to suddenly change my stance and become this really democratic, really nice organization just because they're preventing my athletes from competing in the Olympics. Like I don't really care about that compared to my economic capability. But also, there's national Olympic committees for most part are private organizations that are separate from their national governments. Their sole purpose is to field a team every 4 years. Expecting these private national organizations to perform the work of a government in this case, communicating disapproval of another government's actions is just unrealistic. Therefore, government is unable to prevent further human rights abuses when the space and situation they are targeting do not even impact the actual direct parties capable of making decisions to improve and reform the state of human rights violations. And this is important because we proved to you why, one, their policy is just not effective in deterring or retributing countries, and two, our first and second argument tells you why it also results in further backlash. But also, they say that the Olympics should be about unity and peace. And the premise here was that countries will make offensive remarks on these athletes because of their affiliation to the country, and it leads to greater politicization. That's the premise that we push. First of all, we tell you that unity and peace is just not mutually exclusive. If you're literally allowing athletes from these countries to join the Olympics anyway, people will make remarks about these Olympians anyway. So by saying that they're going to include these athletes, they're literally mitigating their own arguments by taking a super soft, wishy-washy stance. But also, even if we accept this, like even if we bite the bullet, we think that this is much more exacerbated under their side because by purposely excluding these countries, you're providing a platform where Olympics can actually do care about these politics and these political tensions other than the sport itself, given that these countries are already banned from the Olympics. The very fact that the player is literally tied to the banned country will lead to more backlash. The comparative under our world is that we are so much better to protecting these athletes by including these countries regardless of their political conflict. We're not embracing the fact that they are really terrible countries. We're embracing the fact that the Olympics is an apolitical system that doesn't care about other countries. But also, they say that they're able to put pressure to the countries, and they say that like spotlight is good. Firstly, they never prove any mechanism on how a simple spotlight will suddenly incentivize these countries to change their way, as I already told you my responses. So now let me do some points on rebuilding. First of all, we agree with what they say that the Olympics stand for unity, peace, but they also primarily want an apolitical stance. We think that apolitical stance is necessary for the long-term sustainability of sports, because honestly, under their world, like it's still gonna have like a stance on politics, because if I'm at the Olympics and I just like if I see someone wearing like a gray shirt instead of having their flags, obviously I'm gonna realize that, oh my God, they're probably kind of weird and they're part of this different country. And we think that is going to lead to discussion, and that's going to lead to political discussion surrounding the Olympics. And we think that that's very harmful to just and completely just deflects the attention on sports and the purpose of Olympics. But also, honestly, if I'm at the Olympics, I just want to see people play basketball or like swim laps in a fun, competitive sport way, not fighting about human right violations and IR, because I just want to watch sports. We do not think that the purpose of the Olympics is to have these political conversations. But secondly, our second argument on abuses just was not responded to. We tell you why there's a likelihood of abuse, because the people who are primarily in charge of the Olympics board are Western states who have the most power. That is why, for example, in a lot of cases, it was Western states who were awarded in a lot of cases. That is to say that when that happens, when you give the Olympics power to control political paradigms and like international relations, it's really dangerous, because you give them that kind of power with lack of proper international check and balances for politics, because it's like an indirect kind of like soft power kind of thing that you're giving them the power for. And we think that that's very dangerous at the point in which you give them that kind of unprecedented power without actually checking whether it's true or not. We tell you that they're going to abuse this and they're only going to pick and choose certain cases. So now let me move on to my extension on why it's worse for the athletes. Firstly, because no matter what, they will still create a precedent of prejudice and hate surrounding athletes who are born into these specific countries out of birth lottery, because people are still going to perceive people competing in their own as like who are part of that one country that was banned. Because if there's like everyone has a flag and I'm the only one with a gray shirt on, obviously the media perception is that I stand out and people are going to wonder why. In that case, it's not going to manifest in positive perception for these athletes. It's gonna look like negative perception, and that's really harmful, because these athletes who just want to play sports, it's their job to do this, who just enjoy playing soccer, are going to be hated on in media because people are like, oh my God, you know, you're part of this country and you're affiliated to this really terrible country. We think that has backlash for athletes, and it's principally unjustified to do so when an athlete was not part of the crimes that they did. But secondly, no matter what, they still create that kind of prejudice and hate surrounding athletes, because people are still going to perceive these people again as people who are part of this competing country, and we think that that's dangerous. Panel, for you to credit the arguments of government bench, they would have to prove 1, why the IOC would be fair, 2, why developed countries won't abuse this policy, and 3, why developing countries will not react badly. If they cannot prove all of this, their benefits remain speculative. So proud to oppose.
Opposition is correct when they ask the question, who is best able to protect the athletes? But sadly, they are wrong when they say the answer to that is side opposition. We tell you that opposition's analysis of this point is very shallow. To paint the actual reality of what this world looks like for the athletes, let me tell you. In our world, you see that these athletes from these countries that are banned from participating still have the opportunity to compete for themselves. For example, Russian athletes competing in 2024 Olympics as an athlete under the IOC. Yes, our opening has already talked about this. But what our opening hasn't talked about this, responding to this, is that when these athletes are actually representing the countries, which happens in opposition's world, people very much know that these countries have committed these war crimes. Thus, these athletes are actually going to face even more backlash, more obstacles, more discrimination, whether it's within Olympic Village, whether it's online, whether it's just generally on the international kind of stage than compared to our world, because these athletes are inherently linked to the country they're quite literally representing. Thus, we think that opposition's world actually harms these athletes. They do the very opposite of what they aim to do, and we think that government actually benefits these athletes more. Then, one main point of characterization and / setup that our opening has ignored, and onto 2 main extensions. So first, the piece of characterization that we think is so vital to this debate, especially on SideGov, that our opening has not really mentioned, is the idea that the inherent nature of sports is politicized, because sports is inherently a nationalized activity. This, at the end of the day, is the nature of sports, and because it is so nationalized, and because it's such a patriotic activity, if you allow these countries to compete in the Olympics, the highest stage for any international sporting competition, you give them the chance to hie to their nationalistic cause. The purpose of proposition is that, similar to the Russian doping scandal and how Russia was banned, Russian athletes can still compete under the IOC. Except that they don't fly Russian flags, right? When they win, there's no Russian anthem. The country doesn't get the glorification and propaganda, but at least athletes can still compete if they qualify. This is a clear horizontal extension from what our opening tells us, because we painted clearly to you why the inherent politicization of sports means that you need to strip this away from these crime-committing countries, right? Now onto my 2 main extensions in my speech today. One, on how banning these countries from participating actually sets a precedent for broader accountability in the long term, and second extension on how our world actually supports the victims of these war crimes, right? So looking at the first extension on how banning these countries from participating actually sets a very clear precedent for broader accountability on the international playing field, right? We think that as a whole, the Olympics acts as a platform for countries to promote their sovereignty and sell their nationalistic pride and sentiment, things like advancing their nationalistic narratives and goals. Principally, these countries that are found guilty of these war crimes just shouldn't be allowed to have the opportunity to use the Olympics to do so. And thus, when you prevent them and exclude them from participating in the Olympics, you set this kind of precedent where you force them to take broader international accountability, because you're not just presenting this message to the country itself, but also on the global stage, given the spotlight that is shown on the Olympics. We think that there is also a higher likelihood for a trickle-down effect to occur, because you inspire these kind of similar measures to be taken by other cultural and international events. I'll take you in a second, which thus slowly strips these kind of platforms and opportunities to display these nationalistic narratives away from these crime-committing countries. Lastly, what is the impact of this? One, you strip these countries who have committed these terrible war crimes of a platform to advance their nationalistic narratives and goals. You prevent them from promoting their sovereignty. This doesn't just apply to the Olympics solely. This sets a precedent for these countries to be accountable and actually creates a trickle down to other international events. Second piece of impact, you tell a message to the country and the international community that you have a spotlight on the Olympics and you don't condone this. This is not what the Olympics stand for, and you strip this power away from the countries. I'll take that POI.
The precedent under your side of the house is that people don't care about, under our side is that people don't care about political affiliation of countries, so it doesn't matter. Won't that be better under yours than your side, where the players will get backlash from the very fact that they're tied to a banned country?
Like I mentioned in my characterization, I think I've mapped out to you very clearly why sports is inherently politicized. It doesn't matter whether you're banning these countries from participating or not. Even if you let Russia participate in the Olympics, sports is still going to be inherently politicized. You can't simply assert that just because you're letting Russia come to the Olympics, you're depoliticizing sports. Sports is politicized on either side of the house. You simply cannot assert that. Back to my speech on my second extension, right? How our world actually supports these victims of these war crimes and why that is so important. We tell you that one, when you exclude these countries that commit crimes against humanity, this is a form of solidarity with the victims of these crimes. It acknowledges their suffering and stands in support of their justice and accountability. Two, it sends a strong message that the world will not turn a blind eye to this kind of suffering and injustice, and that there are consequences for violating fundamental human rights, even if the consequence may not seem to be that drastic. And it's simply that these athletes can't represent their country. We think that any means of trying to voice this message that at the end of the day, the world does not condone this is a message in itself, and this is all that government needs to prove today. The impact of this is that you openly support these victims who are vulnerable and generally don't have public support. You give them way to amplify their voices and show your public support. And simultaneously, you criticize the people and countries that have harmed them, which coming from an international event like the Olympics is so incredibly important and impactful. Now, lastly, on how we take over our opening, right? We give you two horizontal extensions through one, a rebuttal towards opposition's case, and by comparatively telling you why opposition's world actually directly harms athletes, and the second horizontal extension by characterizing this nature of sports, the political nature of sports, and the link to the impact of our world. Now, number two, we give you these kind of new vertical extensions by telling you, one, why banning these countries from participating actually sets this precedent for broader accountability and thus creates a trickle-down effect that creates impact in the long term. And second vertical extension on why the impact of supporting these victims of these war crimes actually contributes to a super important aspect of the debate both of these extensions our opening has ignored. So what have I told in my speech today, right? First, rebuttal towards opposition's case on how, in terms of when they ask the question, who is best able to protect the athletes, right? The answer to this, us, because we actually tell you that these, when these athletes are competing under the IOC, they're actually more protected than in opposition's world. Two, characterization on how the nature of sports is inherently politicized and how this actually impacts these countries. And lastly, two main extensions. One, how this creates a precedent, and two, how we support victims. Never been prouder to propose.
I think that throughout this debate, teams have come up and told us that the Olympic spirit is that every country should be able to the countries should be able to come together and create this ethical environment for athletes to participate in sports. And I think that the only way that we can actually ensure this is by allowing all these athletes to be able to come here in the first place. And so in my speech, I'll be doing a few things. Firstly, I'll be recharacterizing what exactly banning looks like, what the Olympic spirit is, and why athletes are the most important actors in this debate. Secondly, I'll be giving our two extensions, which is firstly about the principal right of athletes to choose whether to attend the Olympics, and then secondly, how this uniquely harms minority athletes. But then I'll also be responding to OG and CG. So firstly, in terms of characterization, what banning looks like, I think just to talk about OG's model, I think that this is extremely uncharitable characterization. I don't think that you can just say that banning looks like taking away their flag and taking away their anthem, because I don't think this does anything. People still know that this athlete is from this country, and so even if we take their model, I think that this still undermines a lot of their impacts, such as how the audience is going to criticize the athlete. I think that just doesn't, their benefits are undermined, and OG is already at a very weak position in this debate. But then secondly, what is Olympic spirit? OG mainly told us that it's about maintaining the dignity of the Olympics. And so what they told us this means is that you need international pressure to support the people who are being harmed in these countries. But I think that firstly, they lack mechanisms to show us how exactly just providing media awareness will lead to practical change, especially when a lot of these countries are already sanctioning countries such as Russia and actively providing military aid against them. I just don't see how using media attention from the Olympics will make such drastic of a change that will make this drastic change. But then secondly, in terms of like CG, they told us mainly that like sports is inherently politicized, and so that like we need to use and so like we need to use this to like counter like these countries that are like committing humanitarian crimes. But I think that firstly, sports is not inherently politicized. Like it's not like art or media that has a message to it. I think that the reason people come to the Olympics and why they value it so much is that because it's about people coming together. I don't think that it's about each country's nationalism, because at the end in the Olympic ceremony, people don't like rank which country got the most medals. It's more about like the idea of becoming stronger and better together. But then secondly, is that I think even if even if we like on both sides, the Olympics can't be depoliticized. I think that on our side, it's about the message that the Olympic Committee shows people that they're willing to allow athletes to like attend this Olympic no matter what background that they're from. But then the second main thing that CG told us was that you need to stand in solidarity with like victims of humanitarian crimes. Like similar to my response to like OG, I think that they lack mechanization as to why exactly like Olympic media attention is going to make such a big difference that you should stop athletes from joining the Olympics. But then moving on to our extensions. Firstly is the principal right of athletes to choose. And here I'll be explaining why athletes are the most important stakeholder in this debate, which is firstly that a lot of these athletes don't get like formal education. They've spent their whole lives training for this one moment. And usually a lot of people don't go to the Olympics like 2 or 3 times. It's just once in a lifetime chance. Secondly is that there's like a high injury risk for their training, and they basically dedicated their whole lives for this. Thirdly is that there's like a golden year time frame. So this is like extremely important. If you ban them from the Olympics once, then it's very unlikely that they'll be able to go again. And therefore, there's also a huge mental pressure. And so I think that because they've worked 4 years for this one opportunity, it's extremely unjustified for the Olympic Committee to just decide to ban them from the Olympics because they think that their country has done something wrong. And I think that people can make the distinction between countries and athletes. And I think that most people would agree that like after 4 years of work, athletes should be able to choose whether or not they attend the Olympics. And I think that this also directly responds to OG's argument about the audience criticizing the Olympics, because I think that the Olympian athletes will be aware that if they go to the Olympics in a country that is actively accusing their country of committing humanitarian crimes, that they will face the risk of being criticized. But if they choose to do this, even for the passion that they have for their sport, even if they know that there's this risk, I think they should be allowed to make this decision for themselves. But then secondly, why this uniquely harms minority athletes, and I want to take this a step further than what OO talked about, because I think that firstly, not only is there like a Western bias, but I think that countries can use like banning other countries as like a political weapon, but this isn't necessarily fair. And I think that this is extremely important to note, because for like why it's okay to ban some countries because they've committed humanitarian crimes, because it proves that not all of these humanitarian crimes are like objective. And so I think that for example, when like France invites Israel and North Korea, but they don't invite Russia, I think that if the Olympics was hosted in the US this year, then it would have been like a much different scenario. And I think that you can see this as like and I think for these reasons, like the countries that are banned are more likely to see being banned as a direct attack on their country. And this means that there's like more political tension. But then secondly is that athletes are often actually the victims of, is that they're for example, like if you're a female athlete from Afghanistan, this means that under the rule of the Taliban, like females aren't allowed to go outside and play sports. They're also not allowed to get an education. And from before, what I told you about why athletes are the main stakeholders, I think this is extremely important, because this means that it's not just only what OO told you about the athletes wanting to play sports. This is their one chance to get out of their country and do the thing that they love and have been training for their whole life and now aren't able to do because of this authoritarian regime. But then secondly is that it's extremely important for them to inspire young girls. So while I think that it's unfeasible for them to say that media attention from the Olympics will increase, for example, like sanctions on a country. I do think that it's feasible for us to say that these Olympians that are able to compete are extremely important to other young girls who aren't able to play sports.
We think that all three teams in this debate have essentially misunderstood what this debate is about, right? We're telling you that this debate is not about the athletes, as we've already established early on, that athletes are still able to compete even if their nation is banned. We're telling you that this debate is about giving the nations a chance to heighten their nationalistic cause, given that the Olympics is such a high stage, such a international global stage, right? Few things I'll be doing in the speech. Number one, a team by team comparison, why we weigh over the op bench, and then why we weigh over our opening, and then lastly, a row comparison with our worst versus their best case. First of all, they talk about how there are a lot of other ways to punish countries that commit crimes against humanity, like sanctions. We think that still, when you take our case, there really is no harm, especially when their main push is on athletes, because we're telling you that this is not exclusive to their case, right? We're telling you that we still see sanctions on our side. And then they have this push on how this is unfair punishment for the athletes. We agree that it's unfair for athletes who have spent their lives working towards Olympics, right? However, panel, we tell you with our extension, we directly take this argument down because we're telling you with the banning of such countries, you're banning the country alone. You're not punishing the athletes, as these athletes are still able to compete independently, right? And then they talk about how the likelihood of abuse and how you have selective application. We think no, there's a very clear criteria on human right violations given, such as the Geneva Convention, right? We tell you that their argument here essentially overlooks the existence of a criteria for assessing human right violations. We're giving you, such as those that are outlined in the Geneva Conventions and other human right treaties. We're telling you that these frameworks provide detailed basis for determining when a country has committed offenses, which essentially ensures that these decisions are not arbitrary or selective, right? The Geneva Convention essentially sets a clear standard for the treatment of these individuals during an armed conflict, and we outline what constitutes war crimes and crimes against humanity. Take you later at that time. So this essentially helps ensure the assessment that's grounded in international law rather than subjective judgment. But furthermore, panel, even if you don't buy this, even if you want to believe that the clear criteria does not work, we tell you that these countries are very likely to still face a huge backlash, right? Why is this? Assuming that the Olympics actually is biased and abuses its power, we think that the public is not stupid. They're not going to see that Russia is banned and Israel is still competing and just let that go, right? We're telling you that in this scenario, the public is so much likely to campaign hard against Israel, because if the Olympics committee won't serve justice, then best bet the public will. And then lastly, they have this push on how you punish countries based on proper ways, how they want to punish countries based on proper ways. We tell you again, this isn't exclusive to their side. We think that sanctions still happen on our side, and it does because Russia is being sanctioned, right? They haven't actually explained how this is exclusive. And then lastly, they talk about how you lead to more backlash for athletes, how you have prejudice and hate. We tell you no, you don't shame someone for being a Jew, for being a Ukraine, right? So why would you have backlash for an athlete that they themselves have characterized are not tied to the country, right? We're telling that we've already moved past the point of judging someone for their nationality, for where they're from. That's so 18,000s, right? So both sides of governments have already told you that these athletes are competing as individuals. So comparatively, we think that it's even worse on the opposition's world because these athletes are tied to their country and their world, right? When the Russian athletes win, their flag is raised in the air. They stand there as their national anthem is being played. So we think this argument is a major push from OO, but unfortunately, we don't think we can actually credit them for it, given that it's much worse on their side. Moving on to CO, they talk about how number one, our model is an uncharitable definition, how people still know that the athlete is under the country. We think that's not that it's not the point that people will know that the athlete is tied to a country, right? It's inevitable that people will know. However, we're telling you, for the fact that these sports are so nationalized, it's such a nationalistic, supposedly patriotic activity. If you allow these nations to be competing in the Olympics, the highest stage for any international sporting competition, we're telling you that you give them the chance to heighten their nationalistic cause. So we don't think this is uncharitable at all, because essentially we're just taking away the nation, right? This is actually what happens for countries that are banned for other reasons. For example, the example that we brought up in our previous speech with Russia, how they're banned, but they still have athletes competing in the Olympics because these athletes are talented and they deserve to be in it, right? Again, you don't fly Russian flags when they win. You have no Russian anthem, so the country does not actually get the glorification or the propaganda, but at least these athletes can still compete if they qualify. And then they have this push on the principal right for athletes to choose. I feel like CEO might have just completely ignored what we told you, because we tell you that athletes can still compete. They still have this right to choose. We tell you that this argument is not exclusive to their side, right? These athletes still have a principal right to compete. And we tell you that, again, this debate is not about the athletes because we've already established very, very, very early on that this debate is about giving the nations the chance to heighten their nationalistic cause. Panel, we don't think you can actually credit this argument as they have completely just ignored our model and completely ignored what we told you down the government bench. So lastly, moving on, why do we win our opening and just highlighting our extension? Number one, our opening has this push on how you leverage international pressure for change. We don't necessarily think that is very likely that Russia will stop its war in Ukraine because it means that they won't be able to participate in the Olympics. We're not quite sure why they want to push this. Number two, they talk about how being banned from a significant event would be an embarrassment or public humiliation. We don't necessarily think that this is the right mechanization to the argument, as we think that, again, these countries already are well known with the reputation of committing crimes against humanities. So we don't necessarily think that there really is any more embarrassment lower than that. So then we're telling you that why is our extension so important? We're telling you that number one, we're essentially just taking away the platform for these countries to advance their nationalistic goals and narratives, right? Take you later. If I have time, sorry, no. So we're telling you that we're only taking away the nation, we're only taking away this glorification that the nation is able to have when they compete in the Olympics. We're not taking anything away from the athletes, and we properly explain that to you through examples, right? And number two, we tell you that we're actually able to publicly support these victims, give them an actual platform to amplify their voices, which we think is so important because none of the other teams have actually touched on the victims in today's debate. So moving on lastly to a world comparison, opposition's best case is that the Olympics achieves unity and peace, and there's essentially minimal political discourse about these countries, right? We think that proposition's worst case is that our very, very worst case scenario is the Olympic Committee is somehow still biased and they ban countries that don't deserve it, or they don't ban countries that do deserve it, right? And on top of that, I guess that if the athletes from the banned countries aren't able to participate in the Olympics by competing under the IOC, but we think even in this scenario, proposition's worst case still takes over because at least the country will face backlash in places. Even the IOC will face backlash if they do not ban countries when it's appropriate to do so, right? So it's a very clear example. For example, the IOC faced a lot of criticism for letting Israel compete despite the war in Gaza. So why do we win this debate? Number one, we've taken out the opposition bench, and number two, we prove to you why we wait over our opening. Please side with CG.
Sports are for the loud cheers and roars when a player scores a goal. It is for the millions watching in the comfort of their own homes and for the people of different countries to come together as one. It's not supposed to be about politics. It's not supposed to be about pointing fingers, or it's not supposed to be about blocking people off for access. Athletes are the most vulnerable in this debate, and we ought to protect their rights and the fruits of effort. A few things I'm going to talk about in this speech. Firstly, characterization of this debate. Secondly, talk about OG, why we win over them. Thirdly, respond to CG and their arguments. And lastly, talk about why we win over our opening. So then firstly on recharacterization, right? I think there's like this model squabble that's been happening even since like we come down to the end half of the debate. I just want to characterize, what does the world on government side likely look like? Government tells you that, oh, you don't have to have your flag, but athletes are still allowed to compete, for example, like individual Olympic athletes. But I think the more representable world is as follows. You ban every country that is currently guilty of crimes against humanity. You do not let them join, because all countries at some point have committed crimes against humanity, i.e. slavery or slaughtering Native Americans in the US. But secondly, even in the case of IOAs, which is like independent Olympic athletes, there's still a huge problem that exists because IOAs are much less in number than a country national team. That means that there are less opportunities for athletes. The harm that we pose about athlete vulnerability still directly exists in their side of the house. Further, there's direct discrimination of these IOAs. Even if they don't have a flag, I think that's what makes it worse. Their ethnicity, their original nationality, and also the fact that they don't directly have a flag makes it a perfect premise for online haters to send harmful stuff on the internet. So if CO really wants to protect these athletes so badly, I think this directly hurts their case. So then secondly, on the principle of sports and Olympics, which Mimi talks about, which I think was completely unresponded to. Firstly, we think that the point of sports and Olympics is for pure entertainment and enjoyment, sportsmanship, not political, and that is the point of the sport. But secondly, sports are for people to come together. I think this directly clashes with OG's framing by telling that by having these countries participate, it violates the standards of Olympics. So then on OG's arguments, I think they majorly contradicted themselves. They tell you that IOAs are still possible, but then they tell you that there will be backlash if these countries still participate. I think there is still backlash even if these individual athletes participate because they're from that country.
But I just want to respond to their argument. They first tell you that having countries guilty of crimes to compete is a violation of peace and it violates the point of Olympics, and the international community is not going to maintain their appearance. The response here is threefold. Firstly, I think this argument is marginal at best because it's not really greatly impacted. So what if these countries violate peace and point of Olympics? So what if the international community is not going to maintain their appearance? Why is it so bad? Because as long as they are able to justify these, like the international board is able to justify and use our justification that these athletes are insanely vulnerable, I think that'll be able to convince the public. But secondly, I just don't think it's going to be that terrible because in the Paris Olympics, there was only criticism for Israel. I think even at the worst case scenario, it's not going to be that terrible. But thirdly, even if this is completely true, I want to flip their point on the principle of Olympics. Because I think that they are violating the direct principle Olympics stands for. Why is this the case? Olympics are supposed to stand for apathy for political conflicts. They're discriminating and shutting opportunities off against many athletes who are looking for a chance to represent the country that poured money and resources into developing them into who they are. They're not allowing them to show their nationalistic pride in who they are. But the second argument they tell you is about pressuring the countries that are guilty of crimes to change their policy. The response here is twofold. Firstly, there are alternatives to make these countries to change their policy, not just sports, because when you do so, you hurt the athletes. For example, you can change country policies through economic sanctions, protectionist laws, and resource allocation, or just advocacy movements that speak way louder. But secondly, I think there are already a lot of organizations working to help this. The second layer of response here is that I just don't think that this is necessarily true because I'm pretty sure everyone in the world is already aware that these guilty countries are doing these crimes. But the thing is, even though everybody knows the full gravity of this situation, these guilty countries don't genuinely care. They're not stopping. That means that these countries aren't even embarrassed. If this is the case, why is it that they'll likely change their policies on side government, right? But then I just want to move on to CG briefly. I want to point out firstly, there's a major change in their stance because their member actually starts off their speech telling you that the athletes are most vulnerable, but then their whip tells you, oh, like we don't actually care about these athletes. I think they have to directly choose a stance, right? But secondly, I just don't think that they respond to our arguments on an analytical level. They just continuously claim that individual Olympic athletes exist, right? So then on their first argument, which I talked to you about, banning countries sets better accountability. Response here. Firstly, I just want to ask one simple question. What accountability? Because to the hundreds of athletes who are waiting for their turn, training since youth, what accountability did they have to hold to be like completely blocked off from this, right? If they really want to protect the athletes, they had to take down this principle. But secondly, I think that this argument is like likely a reiteration of OG's case where they talk about like bad reputation and how these countries are more likely to change. But I already proved why this argument doesn't work. Why? We already told you earlier that these countries don't care. They literally have worldwide organizations chasing after them and condemning them for the crimes they did. They already have people criticizing them online. Why is it that the simple act of banning going to make it better? It's not, and I think that we directly mechanize to you how this is not. But thirdly, even if this is the case, I think there are better alternatives, healthy ways, because the trade-off here is that athletes and their well-being are on the line. Lastly, the second argument they give you is like athlete discrimination in our world when they represent their country. Response here. Firstly, I think athlete discrimination is symmetric on other sides. Why is this the case? Because on their side, they take away the rights of these athletes to compete. They are actively discriminating against them through doing that. But secondly, furthermore, even in their best case, with individual athletes, they feel even more discriminated because their nationality, they didn't write their nationality, but also the fact that they literally had to neglect their country to compete, and they don't have a flag, and that creates a perfect premise for hate and discrimination. But second layer of response here is that even if athlete discrimination is true, I think the impact of having these athletes participate far overweighs, because we actually tell you, and Mimi tells you, why these athletes are extremely important stakeholders. They only have a certain golden age, prone to throwing their entire career away just because of an injury. They dedicate their entire lives to training, and you as the IOC and global board throw that away because their country did something quote unquote bad. But secondly, I just think that like most of these countries, athletes from guilty countries competing on our side of the house are already going to be aware of the fact that this discrimination lays for them either ways. But the fact that they consented to like participate anyways on our side of the house just takes away the gravity of this argument because it was literally their choice. But lastly, I think it's not going to be that bad because I think at a common level, it's just the public criticizing them, like how they did to Israel this year in the Olympics. Even at the worst case scenario, we were willing to bite the bullet and trade off. Lastly, why are we better than OO? I think we're better than OO because we actually talk about the most vulnerable stakeholders, the athletes that work really hard for a prospect of a future. We also characterize these athletes further and engage on their direct vulnerability, which OO doesn't talk about. Furthermore, I think we characterize the situation and the point of sports and principle of that. Lastly, I think that we show you more mechanisms for the arguments of the principle of sports and Olympics and how countries usually have biases. And I think that we directly engage with the case scenarios of IOAs and give you further analysis as to why this is bad. In the status quo, athletes are hit and washed over by the torrents of their hard work, but they still stand privately. When proposition comes in, that is when they forcibly make the most vulnerable fall. And for that reason, we are very proud to oppose.